The morning mist hung thick over Lake Trasimene on June 21st, 217 BCE, obscuring the water's edge and the rolling hills that embraced its northern shore. For the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius, leading approximately 25,000 to 30,000 men along the narrow lakeside road, the fog was an inconvenience. Nothing more. He had been pursuing the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca for weeks, driven by political ambition and the burning desire to be the man who would finally stop the foreign invader who had already humiliated Rome at the Trebia River. Flaminius could not have known that he was marching his army into one of history's most perfectly executed ambushes, a trap so complete that it would result in one of Rome's most catastrophic defeats and cement Hannibal's reputation as one of the greatest military minds who ever lived. The Battle of Lake Trasimene stands as a masterpiece of tactical deception, geographical exploitation, and psychological manipulation. It was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation achieved not through superior numbers or equipment, but through pure strategic genius. To understand how Hannibal accomplished this remarkable feat, we must examine the context of the campaign, the character of his opponent, the meticulous preparation of the trap, and the brilliant execution that turned a Roman army into a panicked mob fighting for survival on a killing ground of Hannibal's choosing. The strategic context: Hannibal's invasion of Italy. When Hannibal crossed the Alps in late 218 BCE with his polyglot army of Iberians, Africans, Numidians, and Gauls, he embarked on one of history's most audacious military campaigns. The Second Punic War had begun, and rather than wait for Rome to bring the fight to Carthage's territories in Iberia and Africa, Hannibal chose to strike at the heart of Roman power. His crossing of the Alps, a feat many had considered impossible, cost him dearly in men and elephants, but it achieved his primary objective. He was now on Italian soil, threatening Rome itself. Hannibal's strategy was not to capture Rome directly. His army lacked the siege equipment and numerical superiority for such an undertaking. Instead, his plan was far more sophisticated. He intended to shatter the Roman Confederation by defeating Rome's armies so decisively that her Italian allies would lose faith in Roman protection and defect to Carthage. Rome's power rested not on the city itself, but on a complex network of alliances, colonies, and subject peoples throughout the Italian peninsula. If Hannibal could break this network, Rome would collapse from within. His first major victory came at the Trebia River in December 218 BCE, where he had lured a Roman army under Tiberius Sempronius Longus into crossing an icy river to attack his forces. The Romans, cold and exhausted from the crossing, were then enveloped by Carthaginian cavalry and infantry hidden in ambush. It was a stunning victory, but not decisive enough. Many Romans escaped, and Rome's allies remained mostly loyal. Hannibal needed something more, a victory so complete, so terrifying, that it would shake the foundations of Roman power. After spending the winter of 218 to 217 BCE recovering and recruiting Gallic warriors to his cause, Hannibal began moving south through central Italy in the spring of 217 BCE. His route would take him through Etruria, the heartland of Rome's former enemies, and still a region of questionable loyalty to Roman rule. But first, he had to deal with the Roman armies sent to stop him. The antagonists, Hannibal and Flaminius Gaius Flaminius, was one of Rome's two consuls for the year 217 BCE, sharing power with Gnaeus Servilius Geminus. Flaminius was a populist politician, a man who had risen to power by championing the rights of common citizens against the patrician aristocracy. He had previously served as consul in 223 BCE and had celebrated a triumph after victories in northern Italy. He was ambitious, courageous, and, crucially, impulsive. The Roman Senate and its conservative faction distrusted him, and Flaminius knew that a great military victory over Hannibal would silence his critics and secure his place in Roman history. Ancient sources paint Flaminius as reckless and impious. Supposedly, he had ignored negative omens and had refused to perform proper religious ceremonies before taking command of his army. Whether these stories are true or later inventions by his political enemies is unclear, but they reveal something important about Flaminius's character. He was a man in a hurry, eager for glory, and willing to take risks that more cautious commanders might avoid. Hannibal, by contrast, was a master of patience and calculation. Born in 247 BCE into Carthage's leading military family, he had been raised on hatred of Rome. His father, Hannibal Barca, had made the young Hannibal swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome. Hannibal had spent his youth and early adulthood campaigning in Iberia, learning the arts of command, diplomacy, and strategy. By the time he invaded Italy, he was in his late 20s or early 30s, young but battle-hardened, with an almost supernatural ability to read terrain, predict enemy movements, and exploit human psychology. Hannibal understood that he was not fighting a conventional war. He was outnumbered strategically. Rome could replace losses far more easily than he could. Every battle he fought had to count. He could not afford to simply defeat Roman armies. He had to destroy them so completely that Rome's will to fight would crack. This required not just tactical skill, but also the ability to manipulate his enemies into fighting on his terms, in places of his choosing, under circumstances where their advantages were neutralized. The stage was set for a contest between impulsive ambition and calculated genius. The chase. Hannibal baits the trap. In the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal's army marched south from northern Italy into Etruria. His route took him through the Arno marshes, a nightmarish passage through swampland where many of his men fell ill, and where Hannibal himself lost the sight in one eye to infection. But he pressed on, emerging from the marshes into the fertile farmlands of Etruria, where he began systematically ravaging the countryside. This devastation served multiple purposes. First, it provided supplies for his army. Second, it demonstrated to the Italian allies of Rome that Roman protection was hollow. Rome could not prevent Carthaginian armies from plundering at will. Third, and most importantly for Hannibal's immediate plans, it served as bait for the trap he was preparing. Flaminius had been stationed at Arretium, modern Arezzo, with his consular army, blocking the direct route to Rome. When news reached him that Hannibal had bypassed his position and was devastating Etruria, Flaminius faced a terrible choice. He could remain in position, maintaining his strategic blocking force, but allowing Hannibal to ravage Roman territory unchallenged. Or he could pursue, abandoning his defensive position, but potentially bringing Hannibal to battle and destroying the Carthaginian threat. For a man of Flaminius's temperament and political situation, there was really no choice at all. Remaining passive while Hannibal burned and looted would be political suicide. His enemies in the Senate would accuse him of cowardice. The people who had elected him would lose faith. Flaminius had to pursue, and Hannibal knew it. Ancient historians tell us that Hannibal had specifically studied the character of the Roman commanders opposing him. He knew Flaminius's reputation for boldness and impetuosity. He understood the political pressures that would drive Flaminius to seek battle rather than conduct a cautious campaign. Hannibal was not just maneuvering armies. He was manipulating the psychology of his opponent, using Flaminius's own ambition and temperament as weapons against him. As Hannibal's army moved southeast through Etruria, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake, Flaminius's army followed. The Romans moved quickly, eager to catch up with the Carthaginians and bring them to battle. Flaminius's scouts reported Hannibal's position, but what they could not see was the larger strategic picture. Hannibal was not fleeing. He was leading them toward a killing ground he had already selected. The killing ground, Lake Trasimene. Lake Trasimene, located in what is now Umbria in central Italy, is one of the largest lakes in the Italian peninsula. In Hannibal's time, as today, it was surrounded by hills on most sides, with only narrow passages along its shores. The northern shore, in particular, featured a narrow defile, a restricted passage between the lake's edge and the surrounding hills. The road that Roman armies would naturally follow wound along this lakeside route for several kilometers, with the water on one side and wooded hills rising on the other. To Hannibal's tactical eye, the site was perfect for an ambush. The narrow road meant that an army marching through would be strung out in a long column, unable to deploy into proper battle formation. The hills provided concealment for troops waiting in ambush. The lake itself would serve as a barrier to retreat on one side, channeling any fleeing forces into predictable routes where they could be more easily destroyed. Hannibal arrived at Lake Trasimene ahead of Flaminius's pursuing army and immediately set about preparing his trap with meticulous care. He divided his forces and positioned them with extraordinary attention to the terrain and the likely behavior of the Roman army. His heavy infantry, the African and Iberian veterans who formed the core of his army, he positioned at the eastern end of the defile, where the narrow passage opened onto broader ground. This force would serve as the anvil against which the Roman vanguard would first strike. Hannibal himself took position here, where he could observe the initial contact and coordinate the unfolding battle. On the hills overlooking the narrow lakeside road, Hannibal positioned his other forces in a carefully planned sequence. The light infantry, skirmishers armed with javelins and slings, were placed on the heights directly overlooking the road. Behind them, on the reverse slopes and in wooded areas, he concealed his Gallic warriors and the bulk of his cavalry. Every unit was positioned to maximize surprise and to ensure that when the ambush was sprung, the Romans would be attacked simultaneously from multiple directions. The placement of his cavalry was particularly brilliant. Hannibal stationed them at the western end of the ambush zone, where they would cut off the Roman retreat and prevent any survivors from escaping back the way they had come. Once the trap was fully sprung, the Romans would be caught in a pocket between the lake, the hills, Hannibal's heavy infantry to the east, and his cavalry to the west. Having set his trap, Hannibal waited. His men were under strict orders to remain concealed and silent. No fires were lit that might give away their positions. Warriors who had fought for years under Hannibal's command understood the importance of discipline and patience. They waited through the day and into the night, knowing that their commander had prepared something special for their enemies. The Romans marched to doom. Flaminius's army arrived at the western approach to Lake Trasimene late on the day of June 20th, 217 BCE. His scouts had reported that Hannibal's army had passed this way and was somewhere ahead, but the exact position was unclear. A more cautious commander might have halted, sent out reconnaissance in force, and approached the narrow defile with extreme caution. But Flaminius was driven by the momentum of pursuit and the desire to bring Hannibal to battle before the Carthaginian could slip away again or be reinforced by the other consul's army approaching from the east. As night fell, Flaminius made camp near the western entrance to the lakeside passage. The campfires of his army would have been visible to Hannibal's hidden forces in the hills, another piece of intelligence the Carthaginian general could use. Hannibal now knew approximately how many troops he faced and could see that Flaminius had not taken extraordinary defensive precautions. The Roman consul believed he was the hunter, not the prey. The next morning, June 21st, brought an unusually thick fog rising from Lake Trasimene. In the hours before dawn, when visibility was at its worst, Flaminius ordered his army to break camp and resume the march. This decision, to march through a narrow defile in heavy fog, without first scouting the terrain, has puzzled military historians for centuries. It seems almost incomprehensibly reckless. But understanding Flaminius's mindset is crucial to understanding how Hannibal's trap worked so perfectly. Flaminius believed he was close to catching Hannibal. Every day that passed allowed the Carthaginian to slip farther away or potentially link up with reinforcements. The fog, while limiting visibility, also meant that his army was less likely to be spotted from a distance, useful if he wanted to approach Hannibal's camp by surprise. Moreover, Flaminius had no reason to suspect that Hannibal had stopped running and had instead prepared an ambush. Throughout the pursuit, Hannibal had been consistently moving away, avoiding battle. Why would he suddenly reverse course and position forces for an ambush at this particular location? This is the essence of Hannibal's genius at Lake Trasimene. He had so thoroughly established a pattern of behavior, retreating, avoiding direct confrontation, burning and looting but never standing to fight, that Flaminius had been psychologically conditioned to expect more of the same. The ambush at Lake Trasimene worked because Hannibal had spent weeks training his opponent to make exactly the wrong assumptions. As the fog-shrouded Roman column entered the narrow defile, it stretched out for several kilometers along the lakeside road. The heavy infantry of the legions marched in the center, with lighter troops and cavalry interspersed throughout the column. The baggage train followed. The army was in marching order, not battle order, a critical vulnerability that Hannibal had anticipated and planned to exploit. From his position at the eastern end of the ambush zone, Hannibal watched as the Roman vanguard approached. The fog would have made visual observation difficult, but the sounds of thousands of men marching, the clank of weapons and armor, the calls of officers, the tramp of feet, would have carried clearly through the morning air. Hannibal waited until a sufficient length of the Roman column had entered the killing zone, then gave the signal. The trap springs. Total ambush. The first Romans probably died without understanding what was happening to them. From the hillsides above, thousands of Carthaginian light infantry suddenly appeared, hurling javelins and stones down onto the packed Roman column below. In the fog and confusion, it was impossible for the Romans to see how many enemies they faced or from exactly where the attacks were coming. The Roman vanguard, meanwhile, had reached the eastern end of the defile, where Hannibal's heavy infantry blocked their path. These veteran African and Iberian troops, the best soldiers in Hannibal's army, now revealed themselves and charged into the surprised Roman advance units. The Romans at the front of the column tried to deploy into battle formation, but the narrow confines of the road and the sudden assault gave them no time to execute the complex maneuvers required to form the famous Roman battle line. Behind them, the rest of the Roman column descended into chaos. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard or obeyed. Units tried to wheel toward the hillsides to face the attackers, but the terrain and the press of other units made coordinated movement impossible. The careful organization of the Roman legion, its system of maniples and cohorts that allowed for flexible tactics and mutual support, became irrelevant. The Romans were no longer an army. They were a mob of individual units fighting desperately for survival. Then came the cavalry. Hannibal's horsemen, who had been concealed at the western end of the ambush zone, now charged down onto the rear portions of the Roman column, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Romans who tried to flee back the way they had come found their path blocked by Carthaginian cavalry, cutting them down or driving them into the lake. The trap was complete. The Romans were caught in a pocket roughly 4 kilometers long, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Gallic warriors, who had been waiting on the reverse slopes of the hills, now joined the assault. These were warriors fighting in their homeland against the Romans, who had conquered and occupied their territories. They descended on the trapped Romans with savage ferocity, driven by hatred as well as Hannibal's tactical plan. Ancient sources describe the battle as less of a fight and more of a slaughter. In the fog and confusion, Roman units could not find their standards or their commanders. Flaminius himself, caught somewhere in the middle of the chaos, tried desperately to rally his forces and impose some order on the disaster. According to the historian Polybius, Flaminius fought bravely but was eventually recognized by a Gallic warrior named Ducarius, who killed him personally, probably seeking revenge for Roman campaigns in Gaul. The death of Flaminius removed the last hope of organized Roman resistance. Without their commander, with their units scattered and intermingled, under attack from enemies they could barely see in the fog, the Romans disintegrated as a fighting force. Some units managed to maintain cohesion and fought stubbornly, backs to the lake, until they were overwhelmed. Others broke immediately and attempted to flee, only to be run down by cavalry or drowned in the lake as they tried to swim to safety, weighed down by armor and weapons. The battle lasted about 3 hours. By the time the fog lifted and the morning sun revealed the full scope of the catastrophe, most of the Roman army had been killed or captured. According to ancient sources, approximately 15,000 Romans died in the battle itself. Another 10,000 to 15,000 were captured. Only about 10,000 Romans managed to fight their way out of the ambush zone or escape through gaps in the Carthaginian lines. The tactical brilliance. Why the trap worked so perfectly. The Battle of Lake Trasimene stands as one of the most successful ambushes in military history, and analyzing its components reveals the depth of Hannibal's tactical genius. Several factors combined to make the trap so devastatingly effective. First, Hannibal's use of terrain was masterful. He did not merely choose good ground for an ambush, he selected terrain that fundamentally prevented the enemy from using their tactical system. The Roman legion's strength lay in its flexibility and organization, its ability to deploy into complex battle formations with multiple lines that could relieve and support each other. But in the narrow confines of the lakeside road, with the lake on one side and steep hills on the other, the Romans could not deploy properly. They were forced to remain in column, unable to bring their full fighting power to bear. Hannibal had neutralized Rome's tactical advantage before the first spear was thrown. Second, his use of fog and limited visibility was brilliant. Whether Hannibal had anticipated the fog or simply exploited it opportunistically when it appeared is unclear from ancient sources, but its effect was decisive. The fog prevented Romans from seeing the full scope of the ambush, from identifying where attacks were coming from, or from finding rally points. It created a psychological impact as devastating as the physical attacks, the terror of being struck by enemies you cannot see, from directions you cannot determine. Third, Hannibal's positioning of his forces created a killing zone with no escape. The Romans were not merely ambushed, they were trapped in a pocket with barriers on all sides. The lake prevented retreat in one direction, the hills and the forces upon them prevented retreat in another, and Hannibal's heavy infantry and cavalry blocked the remaining routes. This was not an ambush that the Romans could simply fight through. It was an encirclement designed for annihilation. Fourth, the timing of the ambush was perfect. Hannibal waited until a sufficient length of the Roman column had entered the killing zone before springing the trap. If he had attacked too early, much of the Roman army would have been outside the ambush zone and could have retreated or maneuvered. If he had waited too long, the vanguard might have exited the narrow passage and had room to deploy. His timing ensured maximum Roman forces were committed to the terrain where they were most vulnerable. Fifth, Hannibal had psychologically conditioned his opponent through the preceding weeks of campaigning. By consistently avoiding battle and appearing to flee, he had trained Flaminius to expect more of the same. This made the ambush at Lake Trasimene strategically surprising, even though tactically it should have been anticipated. A narrow defile is an obvious place for an ambush, but Hannibal's previous behavior made Flaminius discount that possibility. Finally, Hannibal's discipline and preparation were exceptional. Setting an ambush of this scale required keeping thousands of troops concealed and silent for hours, possibly overnight. It required precise positioning of different contingents in difficult terrain. It required excellent intelligence about the enemy's movements and intentions. And it required confidence that when the trap was sprung, each element would execute its role without needing further orders. This level of coordination and discipline speaks to Hannibal's abilities as a commander and the quality of his army. The aftermath, strategic consequences. The immediate aftermath of Lake Trasimene was catastrophic for Rome. An entire consular army, roughly a quarter of Rome's available military manpower at that moment, had been destroyed in a single morning. Gaius Flaminius, one of the two men leading the Roman state, was dead. The road to Rome lay open, and panic spread through the city. Hannibal's treatment of prisoners after the battle revealed his broader strategic thinking. He separated the Roman prisoners from the allied Italian prisoners. The Romans he kept in harsh captivity, but the Italian allies he released without ransom, giving them a speech about how his war was with Rome, not with the peoples of Italy, and how he had come to liberate them from Roman oppression. This was psychological warfare designed to fracture the Roman alliance system. However, despite the magnitude of the victory, Hannibal did not march on Rome itself. This decision has been debated by historians ever since. His cavalry commander, Hannibal, famously said to him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." But Hannibal's caution was probably justified. His army lacked siege equipment, and Rome's walls were formidable. Moreover, Rome's allies, while shaken, had not yet defected in large numbers. An unsuccessful siege of Rome would have destroyed Hannibal's strategic position and possibly his entire army. Instead, Hannibal continued his campaign through Italy, winning allies among Rome's subject peoples and preparing for the decisive confrontation he knew would eventually come. Lake Trasimene had proven that he could defeat Roman armies through superior tactics, but it had not yet broken Rome's will to resist. For Rome, Lake Trasimene prompted a constitutional crisis and a strategic rethinking. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, giving him supreme military authority. Fabius adopted the cautious strategy that would bear his name, Fabian strategy, refusing to engage Hannibal in open battle, and instead shadowing his army, harassing his foragers, and denying him the decisive confrontation he sought. This strategy was unpopular with Romans who wanted vengeance for their defeats, but it was militarily sound. It would take another disaster, the even greater catastrophe at Cannae the following year, before Rome fully committed to Fabius's patient approach. Historical significance: Lake Trasimene in military history. The Battle of Lake Trasimene occupies a significant place in military history for several reasons. First, it stands as perhaps the largest ambush in ancient warfare, measured by the number of troops involved and casualties inflicted. Second, it demonstrates principles of tactical deception, terrain exploitation, and psychological manipulation that remain relevant to military thinking today. Military theorists have studied Lake Trasimene as a textbook example of how to use terrain to nullify an enemy's advantages. Modern armies still teach the principles Hannibal employed: force the enemy to fight in circumstances where their strengths become irrelevant, attack from unexpected directions, and create conditions where the enemy cannot effectively command or maneuver their forces. The battle also illustrates the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. Flaminius's failure to adequately scout the terrain ahead of his army's march was a fundamental error that Hannibal exploited ruthlessly. Modern military doctrine emphasizes the need to gather intelligence before committing forces, a lesson written in the blood of the Romans at Lake Trasimene. From a historical perspective, Lake Trasimene was crucial to the course of the Second Punic War. While it did not ultimately decide the war's outcome, Rome would eventually prevail through strategic endurance and the brilliant generalship of Scipio Africanus. It prolonged Hannibal's campaign in Italy and demonstrated that Rome could be beaten tactically, even if it could not be defeated strategically. The legend of Hannibal's genius Lake Trasimene contributed significantly to Hannibal's reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. The battle showcased not just his tactical skills, but his ability to think several moves ahead, to manipulate opponents psychologically, and to exploit every advantage that terrain, weather, and human psychology could provide. What makes Hannibal's achievement at Lake Trasimene particularly remarkable is that he accomplished it while operating in enemy territory, far from his base of supplies, with an army composed of diverse ethnic groups with different languages and fighting styles. He maintained discipline and coordination among African infantry, Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, and Gallic warriors. No mean feat in itself. And he did all this while constantly aware that he could not afford significant losses, as replacements were almost impossible to obtain. The battle also reveals Hannibal's understanding that in warfare, the psychological dimension is as important as the physical. By manipulating Flaminius's ambitions and expectations, by conditioning him through weeks of pursuit to expect retreat rather than ambush, Hannibal turned his opponent's mind into an ally of his own strategy. The greatest traps are those the victim walks into willingly, believing themselves the hunter rather than the hunted. Conclusion: a masterpiece of military art. The Battle of Lake Trasimene represents military genius operating at its highest level. Hannibal transformed every element that should have been a disadvantage, operating in enemy territory, being pursued by a larger strategic force, facing an army with superior resources, into advantages through superior planning and execution. He selected terrain that neutralized Roman tactical superiority. He manipulated his opponent into abandoning caution, and he executed an ambush that left his enemies no avenue of escape or effective resistance. The 25,000 to 30,000 Romans who marched along the shore of Lake Trasimene on that foggy June morning in 217 BCE were not defeated by superior numbers or better equipment. They were defeated by a trap so perfectly conceived and executed that they had no chance once they entered the killing ground. They were victims of strategic deception, tactical brilliance, and psychological manipulation orchestrated by one of the greatest military minds in history. For students of military history, Lake Trasimene remains a masterclass in the principles of warfare. Know your enemy, know the terrain, know yourself. Hannibal knew all three with perfect clarity. Flaminius knew none of them well enough. The result was inevitable, not a battle, but a massacre, not a defeat, but an annihilation. In the annals of military history, few commanders have ever achieved such complete tactical dominance over their opponents as Hannibal did on that morning by the lake, where the mist rising from the water concealed the trap that would destroy an army and echo through the centuries as a testament to the power of strategic genius.